So we're gonna kind of do this as kind of makes sense to me,
Okay.
like in terms of like order. So I'm just going to ask you kind of as we talked about, like, how did you mentioned obviously all the things you write, and I'm going to link some things in the chat that I have pre-prepared, but how did you get started authoring like text, not just using other people's, but going like, oh, I could create this.
So, so I think I've always been a storyteller, and I didn't realize this until I started writing. Okay.
Mhm.
I've always been a storyteller, and I've been reflecting on that a lot. I've been taking some writing courses now, and
Wow.
they have you do like this reflection and I didn't realize, but when I was in high school, I had this friend named Nina. Well, first of all, I would go on like really crazy dates. I don't know why crazy things would always happen to me. Okay, like nothing that was unsafe. But when I look back, I'm like, oh my gosh, like that could have totally went wrong in a
Right.
million ways, right?
Right.
And so whenever I would like go on a date or just do something fun, I would come to school and I had a friend
Mm.
and she would say, you know what? Can you tell me a story? Tell me a story. Like I need you to cheer me up, you know? And so I would always just kind of like be around telling the story. I don't know if you've ever seen Eddie Murphy Raw, but um
Yes.
Bob
Yes.
is
The
telling
red jumpsuit.
yeah, so when he was a kid and he was like that like front room scene when he's there, and he's like, you know, and then the gorilla comes out and then he does like so that's kind of how I was. I would just
Amazing.
always tell these stories and have like these like punchlines and people just would always laugh. And I was like, oh, but
Right.
I never thought I was like a storyteller. So fast forward when
Amazing.
thank you. When I started teaching, I was teaching an IB program and I was, you know, I was using, I was writing sort of my own informational text, and that's another specialty of mine. Like, I am a frustrated researcher, so I love to just research, and I just pull from a lot of, pull from a lot of resources, and I like to sort of put my own spin on sort of like info, like kind of like a report.
Absolutely.
So I started doing that in class and just really comprehensifying, you know, the curriculum. And this was before I even knew about comprehensible input. I
Right.
just was doing this so that my IB students could actually read something and we can talk, have meaningful conversations in the
Mm,
class, you know. And so and that really worked well. You know, it worked well. And you know, and I remember we our school was featured in it was featured in some on some program in Chicago. And I remember them coming into the class and the kids were speaking Spanish and I was just like, oh my gosh,
mm,
like this is crazy. Like I was like, okay, I have something here.
right.
So
Wow.
after I started using just like your regular CI novels, you know, and I really enjoyed the experience because I like to focus on reading for the sake of conversation. I think
Mm,
reading is a perfect
yes.
catalyst. I'm not just like read, read, read. I'm like, no, read and talk about it. That's what we want to do, right?
Right. Like
And
a book club.
yes, yes, and that's why I do book clubs. That's why I do book
The
clubs. That's why I
reason
do
people do book clubs or like Bible study, like, y'all want to read a
yeah,
thing? Y'all want to talk about a thing? Great.
right. Exactly. Yeah. And so so
Mm,
I, you know, read a few books with the class. And then once I kind of got into it, I just realized and kind of as I moved around a lot and worked with different populations, I just kind of realized that a lot of the books were not really representative of my students. Like not
mhm,
necessarily like racially diverse, but like some of the experiences that they had, you know, just like little stuff. You know, I
right.
thought a lot of the books, and let me just this is my disclaimer. I didn't read a lot of the books, but the books, the small sampling and selection that I read, okay?
Mm,
So this big global opinion that I have, it's probably based on like maybe 5 or 6 books, okay? So I don't want anyone saying like, AC Quintero said this, you know?
and
Um,
another thing, right? You're like,
yeah, right.
right.
And so, and I mean, I thought the books were really, I mean, I thought that they served a great purpose, you know, but I also wanted like, I don't know, I just wanted something else for like my kids, you
Yeah.
know, and then I always would say, I always said, I was like, my kids are from Chicago, like they need a little bit more action, you know, because
Right.
there's
Right.
always stuff popping off in Chicago. And so anyway, I set out to just not necessarily write a novel. So that was never my purpose. I never was like, I'm gonna write a novel.
Wow.
I just wanted to write a story
Mhm.
that my students, you know, loved, you know. And so that's when I started with actually the first book I wrote wasn't the first one I published. So that's
Mhm.
that. So I
Wow.
started with the book a long time ago, but
Okay.
I wrote La Clase de Confesiones. That's kind of like the first one that I have published. And when I gave it to my students, so here's the funny thing. I wrote that book because number one, I do thematic units and I still do thematic units and I'm a big fan of thematic units and I just work in the CI, that's like
Yeah.
kind of like my sauce.
Yep.
And my students, the way that I was teaching, my students they weren't really understanding like verbs and structures and then the vocabulary. So I had to tell them like 10 times like what a lapis was. And I was like, what more can I do? Like, I was like, we're going over this all the time.
Right.
So what I decided to do was I said, you know what? I'm going to take all this vocabulary and I'm
Mm.
going to put it in a story and we're going to read story in class and it's going to have a lot of repetition. Kind of like those little books there because I still kind of wasn't like I was doing CI, but I wasn't like a
Totally.
spire.
Yep.
And when I put the story together,
Mm.
it kind of was based on a kid in my class. That was the other thing. There was a kid in my class, everyday side story, sidebar. A kid in my class, every day he was like looking at this girl, and I would stop class and I was like, you gotta stop. I was like, you know what? I'm gonna put you guys together. I'm gonna seat you together. And so I think that was kind of a jumping off point for the book. And then the other things that I would do in class that I feel inevitably kind of worked its way into the book was whenever they would text in class, I would grab their cell phone and then I would say, clase, tenemos una confesión. And then I would pretend to read this confession that they had. And
Amazing.
I know. And so the kids, it's funny because like they loved it. Some of them, I feel like they left their phones and they would text just so I can grab their phone and do that. Okay, now here, let me land this plane. This
Right.
this is where this is where it all clicked. So we're reading the story in class, okay? We're reading the story. And again, I'm just like, this story just so they can learn some
Mm.
vocabulary or whatever. And all of a sudden, I had a few like basketball stars in my class and, a few other kind of popular kids. And they were just the cool kids, right? And this kid,
Mm.
he was like on the edge of his seat. He was like, oh my gosh. He was like, this book is lit. And his friend was like, I'm on the edge of my seat. I don't know what's going to happen next. And another kid was like, this kid is so stupid. He's so stupid. I can't. At that point, I was like, you know what? I was like, this is something that they like. This is a story that they like because it doesn't, I felt, again, me personally, I just felt that so many stories were just so like perfect. It was like,
Right.
oh,
Right.
you make a mistake and I'm like, that's not how life works. Like
Right.
your teachers are not always nice. Like a lot of my teachers in the books, they're jerks because those were my teachers. My
Right.
teachers were always jerks, but in some weird way that helped me as a person,
Yeah.
so it didn't bring
Absolutely.
me down. So anyway, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes. Well, I think again, like you see what so many of us see, which is you get inspiration from your students and you realize what works and what doesn't work with them. I mean, the year, like confession session, the year I was put on a professional development plan, which is like, girl, you ain't good at much. Like you need to get better at this. It's a hop, skip, and a jump from like either getting fired or keeping your job, depending on how you handle it.
Okay.
Um, I got put on one of those, and that was the year that I was realizing they're not connecting with a lot of these
Mm.
textbook resources. And I'm making these like ridiculous slideshows with my face on like celebrity bodies, like early PowerPoint, where I was like, I can just like trim around my face. This will be hilarious and different kind of like comprehensible input things that like you said I didn't know that's what that was. I was just
Yeah.
like this one thing is kind of dry and I would like to transition them. And it's so funny how those natural stories in class crop up and then you're like, hold on, how do I use that, like how do I harness that power, because unless you're taught how, you're just like, uh-oh, I've been interrupted. Like somebody comes to
Yeah.
your door, and before Grant Boulanger, was like every interruption is a blessing. Like every interruption is a chance to be like, oh, look, the classroom phone rang. Buenas tardes,
Right.
kind of
Yeah,
a,
that's true.
and I was like, what? Like I never thought of it like that because I was like, ugh, what? Like, oh, you need
Right.
Cecilia for checkout. Ugh, like, fine. Like, ugh, like, stop interrupting. But treating those interruptions like, like an expectation. And so the same thing, treating those dramatic stories like an expectation. That's a thing that's going to happen inevitably. They're going to go, like you said, man, this boy is stupid, and you're like, da 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 da, and they're going to have their own narratives and like hilarious. So why not build on that energy? Florencia Henshaw mentioned in the chat, how much do you get inspired? Having said that, how much do you get inspired still by reality slash real experiences versus things you may have read, watched, seen when it comes to authoring?
So, okay, so I would say, just going back to that story, like
Mm,
that story was sort of a hodgepodge of a lot of things. It was like, I got sort of inspired by this kid in class, and then with my cell phone thing, but also I was a matchmaker at my school. Like I was like telling kids, like, hey, you should really think about taking this kid to prom because
mm,
I have this kid in my fourth period class, and like in a very like safe way, and I was also
absolutely.
kind of like, kind of giving them a relationship advice. They would call me life hack, and so, so I think it is. I don't really know if I can quantify it. I think it just
Mm,
really depends on the story that you want to tell and like how you want to tell it. I really like a lot of my stories. I would say, and when I say stories, I'm not talking about just the novels that I've published. Like I have a
mm.
lot of short stories, that I work with as well. Nilan loves Eres Perfecto, and I'm telling you, Nilan,
Yes,
I have not done that story in 2 years. I'm doing it this year because you're always posting about it, and I'm like, that's
yes.
no, that's crazy. I need to do that. Um, so I don't know. I guess I would say, I don't know. I don't know how I would quantify it. I would say that I'm very obsessed with technology.
Mm,
I do. Oh, that's where I was going. Sorry. So I do have quite a bit of stories focusing on technology. Like I have this one story that's about like how technology, how it disrupts family life, and like family
wow.
values and things like
Yeah.
that. And then I know like with El Escape, it's like kids making decisions that are going to decisions with technology that affect their life. I know I have another story that's is called No Pasa Nada, and it's about sexting, but it doesn't say sexting, and then the pictures are like this girl in her pajamas or whatever. But
Uh,
it's not. It kind of alludes to like sending a personal picture, right?
totally.
And yes, the one with the grandmother. That's one of my favorites. Yes, I have another technology one. It's called Caray, mi abuela tiene móvil inteligente, un móvil inteligente. Like my grandma has a cell phone. And that's kind of like a love story. And that story, can I just say, I wrote that story with the same premise. They were not getting this vocabulary with technology, and I was doing a PBL unit. And I was just like, okay, I'm going to write a story. And in the story, it's going to be a grandmother who gets a smartphone because that makes sense to me, right? A kid is not going to get a smartphone and be like, oh, I can download, I can do this, I can do
Right.
that. And
Right.
at the time, my grandmother was always calling me, bless her soul. And she's just like, my computer won't come on, my phone won't come on. I was like, okay, it's a button on the side. So that was my inspiration. I just like take these little things and I make something beautiful out of them.
Right. Grandma, hit the button. Like,
I know. Her computer, okay, side note, my grandmother has a computer and she had it for like 6 months and she's like, I can't believe I bought this piece of crap. I went over there, literally turned it on. And she was like, how did you make it work? And I was just like, you know what? I'm so glad God has given me so much patience. I was like, that is just where she is. That's how I am with Zoom. Yes, empathy, empathy, empathy.
I am so I and I'm better. See, like you're an amazing person. I'm terrible because I get super impatient with my own like parents that I'm like, somebody else take them. Like I'll handle your grandma, you switch and you because you'll be way more patient with somebody else. Cause I'm like, mom, you are ridiculous. Like get like this. Why better you than me. Also my grandpa anyway, yeah, like no. Good for you. Like this my dad still has a flip phone and like in public he's like, "Hold on, flip." I'm
Well, he
like,
doesn't have to worry about hackers. That's the good thing. He doesn't have to worry about
"Right,
hackers.
guess who's not they're not stealing from him because
Yeah,
he's not even taking pictures."
I'm thinking about going back.
Part of me, right, landline, call me. When you get me, you get me. Like hit me when I'm home. Okay, thanks. Yeah, like the old days. when you had to talk to an adult, okay? And I'm not the adult.
I know, right?
Oh, no, absolutely. Well, I was thinking too, like, so when you I think back to some of those early, like early PowerPoint when I was like doing kind of the, I mean, obviously not to the degree, like just doing that thing where you're adopting, like adapting and adopting, right? Like things where you're like, my kids aren't getting like A plus L is all or like, because they don't care, because it doesn't matter till it matters.
Yeah.
Also, when does it matter? Not sure.
That's
So,
the point.
like, I mean, like, if you literally are saying, like, de el blah, 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 is a native speaker going to stop you? Probably not. Like, they understand exactly what you're saying. So, A, how are we prioritizing what we're teaching? And and I think back to that context when I was like, man, this is hard. And it was like totally textbook, page 32, page 33, that kind of thing. And so, how are we prioritizing or just at least making sense of what we're teaching? But also, how are we customizing it? And so, my question is like, for you and for anybody, when we talk about like authoring our own text, when we talk about like speaking based on our experiences, we look at our students and we go, okay, they need a story that, does whatever or includes whatever. For you, is there any point where you feel like you can't like author certain things, like certain narratives or certain perspectives? Like for me as a non-native speaker, I'm like, oh, can I even speak to, whatever? I've never had any interest, but like also how would I know that my Spanish is good enough? Like what's your process like in deciding and then in going forward from there?
So it's very interesting you bring this up because I was talking to a friend earlier and we are talking about
Mhm.
Isabel Allende. She
Mm.
wrote a
Oh,
fabulous book.
okay.
And I keep confusing the name. I think it's La Isla Bajo Mi Piel, like
Mm.
the island beneath the sea or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And it's told from the perspective of a Haitian slave, So it takes place in Haiti around the Haitian Revolution. And she ends up going to New Orleans, and I have to say that she's really my inspiration as a writer because I think that the art of writing in general, and I want to just write, not just CI stuff. I want to just continue
Mm.
writing because I really love writing.
Yep.
I think that it really is the capacity to channel these different stories, and obviously she did like a lot of research, she definitely, she did her due diligence. I have to say that as I read her book, and I'm not lying, I flipped back to the cover several times to look at her name. I just was like, how the hell did she
Right.
write such a moving book?
How
And
dare you?
yes, I
Right.
mean, and I wasn't, and I'm not Haitian, but I can relate in terms of just my Black woman intersectionality.
Right.
And I mean, that character spoke to me. I was just like, oh, this girl just did it. I was like, oh my gosh. And it was just I mean, it was just a well-rounded character. And there was so much history and it was everything was just, to me, it was from what I've read and just um from different experiences, it was just on point. I'm like,
Mm.
she did a good job. So, I don't limit myself. I mean, like, I feel like you should write about what you know about,
Yeah.
and and if there's a particular subject that you're called to write about and it intersects with your experience,
Mm.
I believe that, yeah, you should write. Now, I do believe that you have to be very, careful as well.
Yeah.
You have to be
Sure.
careful. You have to do your research. I have one book. It's called El Último Viaje,
Mhm.
and it's based on a true story about a model turned mule, and so even though, like, the story is a true story, but I fictionalized a lot of it to make the situation more kind of like this person was in the very, it was like a catch 22,
Right. Right.
and that was and my reason for doing that, honestly, was because I wanted my students that were just so familiar with the narrative anyway. I wanted my students to see, like, everything's not black and white. Like,
Mhm.
people don't commit crimes just because they're greedy or whatever. There are also
Mhm.
extenuating circumstances around this,
Right.
And I remember reading that book in class, and one of the questions that I asked them was, and the funny thing is, sometimes I reread that book and I can't believe I wrote it because I just don't, I was just really inspired at that moment. I was inspired and, worked with a cultural consultant, worked with, my husband and like other people to
Mm,
really bring it about. And and I don't know, I was very inspired. But I remember in the class, I challenged my students. I said, okay, so let's think about the main character and let's think about what she did, right? Um, I said, who pretty much the question was, who would you sacrifice yourself for? Because she was sacrificing herself for her grandmother who
right,
couldn't, get like health insurance,
right.
and this took place in Colombia, and it really, these are situations where, like I said, the healthcare system.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I asked students this, and one student said to me, her mother worked at the school and was in a wheelchair,
Mm,
she said, and I think a few of us in class teared up. She said, I would do anything. I would do what this girl did in this story if I could give my mom the ability to walk again. And I mean, it just like, I was like, oh my gosh, like,
okay,
and that's what I wanted to get across to them. I wanted
right.
to get across, not like, looking at these negative circumstances, but also not looking at them like, okay, people do things, like, let's look past what people are doing
Mm,
and look at the situations that they feel forced to make these decisions, and
absolutely.
society that force people to make decisions. And we can apply something like that takes place in another country universally. We can apply that
Right.
here in the US. My kids, I'm like, I'm sure that you're probably at some point, came to school with something on you. Or I'm just saying, I
No,
mean, I didn't say that
100%.
in class, but
Mhm.
yeah, so I would say, I don't know. I think it's a delicate balance. I think
Mm,
that sometimes you have to sort of question
mm,
why you want to write about something,
mm.
and then whatever it is, I feel like it should just, you really have to find that delicate balance and find people who are willing to really help you, and really tell you the truth.
Absolutely. Well, and like exactly, like and keep you in check of like, you're writing this way, but really it's that way, or that kind of thing. Like, or it sounds like it's whatever, but really, it's whatever. And I think that's hard whenever we write anything like that we
Yeah,
literally haven't experienced,
right.
like any kind of author. Myra Canyon and I talk about this a lot, like any kind of author freedom. Like if we're restricted to only what we've experienced, like then where's the creativity piece? Or like you said, where is what you're kind of called to
But we
write
wouldn't have
about?
movies, for example. There are a lot of movies we wouldn't have. There are a lot of books we
Literally,
wouldn't
right,
have.
right.
Yeah.
We literally wouldn't have, and we wouldn't have a lot of the learning that we have. So then as long as I think we're looking critically at that, because I look at some of the novels I've read because I added them to my classroom, and I did that thing where I didn't read them until I added them, as one does, where you're like, yeah, I'll buy this and this and this because they're like real cheap at the conference. And
Yeah.
then you get back and you're like, hold on, let me make sure there's not anything crazy. Oh, yeah, that's don't love that, and like whatever, money in, money out. Okay, whatever. It is what it is. But like all of those things, a lot of those historical points, I learned as a teacher. Like it wasn't being prepared to be a teacher. It wasn't as a language student. A lot of things I've learned from literature and from history and from culture have been from professional development, from fellow like author, like teacher authors like you, and different people, where I'm like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing. Oh, cool. Let me look that up, whatever. It was like from some aspect of some resource I was thinking about using, which I thought was pretty cool. And so I think that's part of what we need to do is obviously investigate our resources, but then also look at who we're inviting to the table to be able to create those resources. Because if it's like exclusively like you must be Cuban to write about Cuba or whatever, like, okay, well, then who is there, or what do we do for that? Would we rather sacrifice the knowledge or the best interpretation of this story that we can do, and then we go from there. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Well,
like, you know, what
well,
do we
yeah.
sacrifice?
I feel like I think there's enough room at the table. I feel like there's enough room at the table for everybody, you know?
Literally. Yes, absolutely.
So like
Mhm,
again, going back to Isabel Allende, I would also read maybe a story that's,
mhm.
written by someone who's from, like that. Just because I read Allende's book and I love her book doesn't mean I'm going to say like, oh, I'm not going to read a book about this same topic from someone that's from the culture. You know what I mean?
Mm,
I'm like, yeah, I
right.
want to read that as well. But I can just tell you from my experience that like her book was very culturally enriching. And here's a funny thing, and I just think about my collection in general. So if you look at my work, I actually most of my books are um, sort of just tied to different topics. Like I don't really have a lot of like I think that book and then Como Salir de la Zona de Amigos. Those are the only two books that really like tie in with like another culture.
Totally.
But like most of my books, like my series, for example, Las Apariencias Engañan, I did not. So when I first started writing, let me just say, I thought that there was this pressure because I all these CI books they took place in like these different cultures, right?
Hmm.
And when I wrote La Clase de Confesiones, I was like, well, I mean, his name is Carlos Solis, you know, and I just was like, I don't really think culture matters. I'm like, he's just a kid from Chicago, and it
Mm,
has no bearing on what happens in the classroom, right? The same thing with like my series Las Apariencias Engañan and El Escape. Those books they take place in a
mm,
fictional town in Latin America that I made up, and like this town gets invaded by aliens, all this stuff happens in this town. Like they're like in my book they're characters that they use like some characters use vos, because like some things
right?
happen in Argentina, and I just personally like I just didn't feel comfortable
Mm,
or or knowledgeable enough at that point to, or not that it was necessary for me to connect it with a culture, because I just thought the book is about that series is about sort of teen life, teens being messy, like hella messy, and then getting hunted by aliens. That's kind of how the series, ends.
uh-huh.
So like I feel that there's a lot of undue pressure on people to act the cultural piece. And this is the reason why. So
Mhm.
I've thought about this a lot. Really comprehensible like input those novels, they I've always seen the culture piece as an additive. I do not
Hmm.
read books. I don't use these books so that I could,
Wow.
teach so I can teach about culture.
Right.
I feel like what a lot of authors do, or how I see it, is that the main purpose of that book is for it to be comprehensible, for
Mm,
students to get something that's at their level, that's accessible, and they add the culture for the teachers
mm,
so that the teachers could kind of like kill two birds with one stone, right?
uh,
So they're teaching the language and then they learn some cultural bits. I've never thought like, okay, I'm going to use this book that's by this author to teach about,
mm,
that this is going to be my only piece for teaching about Argentina. No, I'm going to use the book as a conduit, and
mm,
then we're going to look at tons of authentic sources about Argentina. So that's kind of how I've always seen it. And I think that because a lot of books connect with culture, authors think that they have to find a culture, that they have to write about that in their books, and they don't. I have 10 books, and I want to say like only two of them really have like a strong like cultural element. Everything else is just people living their life, teens just doing crazy stuff and being teens, and like maybe some little sci-fi stuff here and there,
mm.
and I enjoy that, and the kids enjoy it and the teachers enjoy it. So I don't think you really need to, you know necessarily look for like an anchor culture for your book. Now if you're very fond of a country, like I know one of my friends, she travels a lot to Guatemala, and she's like lives there in the summer, and so you know naturally that's going to be part of her book.
Mm,
I've been married for 17 years. I've been with my husband for 20 years, been going back and forth to Colombia for a long time. So there are some, even with the language, there are some
mm,
Colombian elements because that's the language that I'm exposed to. And I know like some people are like, Well, are you appropriating? No, that's the language. It's like that's how I learned Spanish. I can't help that. These are the expressions that I learned. This is what I learned. It is a part of who I am. It is actually a part of my identity as well. You
Right.
know. So anyway, I guess I want to say that. Like, I don't think we have to have that pressure, but if it comes naturally and you do like, and you do your research and you present it in a very respectful way, I think that's fine. Can I just add one more thing to that? Okay. So and this is about working with like someone, like when you are writing a cultural novel, a novel that deals with a culture, working with someone from that culture. So I'm working on this novel, and so this will be my third novel that really kind of adds a lot of cultural elements. It takes place in a different culture. And the funny thing was, I worked with two people. I worked with two people. So the book kind of is about it is about a journalist. A journalist is she's part. It's about a lot of things. It's kind of sci-fi-ish, but it's about journalists. So I'm working with a journalist from that culture who happens to go to my church, and she's like so excited reading these. She's so excited reading the story, right? And then I
Amazing.
work with someone else. Now, when I worked, I'm going to say friend A and friend B. Okay, so and they're both from the culture. One is a teacher, and the other one is a journalist. And it's interesting because person A, when they read the script, they gave me really good advice, and they said, it sounds like you are leaning politically in this,
Mm,
and I just thought about it, and I was like, and I had to step back, and I said, yeah, because that is my opinion of what is going on. And so I did that, helped me to just neutralize it a bit, you know. But then when I worked with the other person, and this is what I realized later, they're both two different political parties. So when I worked with my friend who's a journalist, she was like, you need to go harder. And so I just, I decided to make, to really just be in the middle,
mm,
because I said, actually, I had to question myself. I said, the goal of this story isn't really to talk about necessarily like politics. It's
right.
to talk about this specific issue that, and then it kind of goes into like, this like sci-fi realm or whatever.
Right.
And so once I kind of had clarity about that, I'm like, okay, I'm good. But that is why you need to have someone else, other people from, the target culture read, because I thought everything was fine. I thought everybody thought this. Like, this is what I see on the news all the time. What are you talking about? And, it helps to have somebody to kind of be that filter, and obviously it's good to work with different people. Like, I have this person who's, she's kind of left, right leaning, another person who's left leaning. And I'm just like, be in the center. Think about the US, think about the US, you writing a novel, and think about how some people may portray a certain political figure, and how
Right.
other people. So it's like you have to be, and just go in the middle and try to be as neutral as possible.
Steady. Right. And that's a great comparison because you have, Martha had mentioned in the chat, what is the objective of bringing certain stories, if they're not our own stories, to the space of visibility, but at the same time, super engaging. This story can be super engaging, but also like difference of perspectives, like all of the things. Oh, like it's really hard to say, like you said, like I had cultural input, I had proofreaders, like I had all these things, and yet maybe someone still thought it was blank, whatever blank is.
Sure. And I think that that's fine. I respect everyone's opinion. I
Mm,
don't think, yeah, I definitely, I respect that, because I have my opinion about other people's,
right,
everything else.
right.
But I do feel that writing is it really is a creative process. And,
Mm,
you just, and if you feel called to write something, um, and I feel like if you're passionate about it and you go about it the right way,
mm,
kind of like me teaching Spanish. It's like I am like super passionate about
right.
about teaching Spanish. I'm African American. We do have Latino heritage in our family. On my mom's side, um, But I'm saying as far as like how I identify and how I grow up,
Mhm.
but I love speaking Spanish and I love,
Right.
and I love that culture. And, maybe some people, both, from both sides, some people look at me and say, like, oh, well, you're trying to be somebody else. No, this is just what I love. And I'm just trying to
Mm,
communicate, and I think about that. Um, I think about that with writing as well. And I'm just not a big fan of people trying to tell me what's right.
mm,
I'm just like, we got government trying to tell us what to do with our bodies and what this and that. I
right,
don't have no time for that. No
right.
time for that.
Over it.
If you don't like it, don't buy it. And if
Right,
you find something offensive that's truly offensive, let's talk about it. But that's as far as I'm willing to go
right.
with the conversation.
Well, I
So
think that's the thing is like, when people find things that are problematic and there are, they are there and you go, there's the emotion behind like, "Oh, I spent money on this." Well, let's follow the money. Was it school money? Was it your own money? And when it's your own money, you're like, "Oh, I spent my own money on this." And then I reread it, through a different lens and I'm realizing, that's a whole different process than "Ugh," like let's get out and let's, demonize or villainize, whoever the creator was or whatever. I mean, that's a whole to me that's a whole different thing, like you said, as opposed to being called to write something, consulted X amount of things and whatever, like we're all doing the best we can. We're all using what resources we have. I mean, like what not what more do you want, but there's an aspect of just like, do you not want this resource? I guess if that makes sense.
and
Like if
yeah,
somebody felt
that's
compelled to
fine.
create it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
And that's fine. I'm gearing up to teach a class with this company called Idioma. And
Mm,
and
yeah,
by the way, this isn't a plug, but uh,
I'll
but
look it.
the course is about integrating Afro Latinx, Afro Latino, Latine, Latina
Yeah.
um, culture and identity into the curriculum. And so I've been doing a lot of research. And one of the things I found is, I started with, because we're going to read some texts that come out of Cuba. And a lot of the authors, there's some authors of some really foundational texts that are white Cuban. And they
Mm,
write about the Afro Cuban religion experience because those were the people who were allowed to sort of document this type of stuff. And it made me think about Alejo Carpentier. So let me just tell you, this is one of my all-time favorite authors. He's from Cuba. Alejo Carpentier. When I first read his book, I was like, I was in class and my teacher was like, "Oh my gosh, I love him." And and he's like, white affluent Cuban. This was like he
mhm.
wrote like I want to say like the 30s or something. He's part of the boom. Well, anyway, or maybe 60s, I'm sorry. Anyway, I was like, this dude is racist. I was like, this is the most racist book I've ever read in my life. I was like, this is ridiculous. And I would argue with the teacher, okay? So this was an undergrad. So then I took a graduate class and I had to read the book again. And let me tell you, it is one of my favorite books. I was just like, I just understood. And it wasn't racist. It was,
Right.
I think it was my inability to understand some stuff in Spanish, probably. Maybe
Maybe,
I was
but
like,
also like life in undergrad, you're like, what? Like I didn't know anything.
"Yes,
No, none of us knew
well,
anything.
yeah, and actually, like, okay, so the way I read it the second time, I read it through the
Mm,
character's lens. And I just saw things differently. I was like, oh,
mm.
I see what he's exposing here. And so then El Reino de este Mundo. No, 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 not that book, but that's one of my favorite books too. No, this is El Siglo de las Luces. Oh,
Mm.
I want to read it again. Oh my gosh, just thinking about it, I just shake all over. Um, Siglo de las Luces. But I do like El Reino de este Mundo. Okay, Regina, that book is the freaking bomb.
Yeah.
Like that's another book that I fought my teacher on because she said some crazy stuff too, and I had to check her. Sorry. Okay, so
Popped it in the chat.
anyway,
Hello.
I know.
Like, let
Anyway,
me stir the pot. Paste.
I know, right? So yeah, after I read it again, and it helped me understand
Mm,
the culture
wow.
and the time period. It helped me understand the culture, the time, so many things. So I mean, and obviously, I mean, he was fluent, he was a writer, he was the person who could like bring
Right.
that story. And I've read a lot of black authors from Cuba as well. I've read a lot of black authors. So
Mm,
so I don't know. I mean, I know it's a kind of complicated I know it's a complicated question. I don't think that my answer is necessarily kind of like, I don't know. I just feel like I'm just giving my granito. My
Oh,
granito.
of course. Well,
Okay.
I think literally, like everybody's granito is their granito because I think, like you said, you made me feel so much better. Like as a non-native speaker teacher, when we look at authorship, when we look at creating literally anything, I'm like, uh-oh, I'm a fraud. Like, and I always feel like a fraud at conferences. I feel like a fraud
Mm.
at workshops because we're surrounded by these beautiful, amazing native speakers. And I'm like, oh man, like I'm never going to make stuff like you, or I'm never going to have the perspective of you because I didn't, I'm not, and then insert identity thing here, like I'm not from blank. I don't have blank. And I think a lot of that is behind those things of like, well, what perspective can we write from, or what perspective can we create from? Well, that's a bigger conversation. What perspective can we teach from? Because LJ Randolph said a couple of weeks ago, or last week, I think it was last Tuesday, said that when students ask in his class, like, what kind of Spanish are we learning? He's like, kind of like institutionalized. And he used this word, and I was like, oh, that's kind of nice. And then other people in the chat were like, that feels kind of constricting and kind of like clinical. And I was like I could totally see both sides because institutionalized felt good because I, as a non-native speaker, am uncomfortable with whatever type of Spanish I tell you that we're learning in here because I'm like, well, I learned from mostly
Oh,
people
okay. I see what you're saying.
you know what
Okay.
I mean?
I see
Like,
what you're saying. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
like I'm like, I learned from mostly people from Mexico for the first like 3 years of my acquisition journey. And then it switched to Spain and whatever.
I just said
Now
my
it's
kid's Caribbean because I've had nothing but Caribbean, and my husband's from Caribbean. I've had nothing but Caribbean
right, right.
teachers.
I've had like Mexico, Spain, nada más. Like that's it. And so it's so funny how personal those experiences are to us, and then to our travel, to our relationships, like to our whatever. And so his use of like institutionalized Spanish, I was like, oh, I kind of like that because it like took the pressure off to like define.
I guess my husband speaks institutionalized English, I guess.
Right.
And like, I mean, it's kind of like the same thing. Like,
Exactly.
he's from
Mhm.
he's been here for like
Yep.
20 years, so he speaks more like a Chicago version.
Absolutely. Mhm. It's like so fun. It was like freeing because I was like, "Oh, thank you." And then like Marta and a couple others were super brave in the chat, and they were like, "Phil's kind of clinical." Like Phil's, and I was like, "No, yes, but also yes." Because like I'm not a native speaker, so I was like, "Thank you." Like I want to be able to define
But okay, but here's the
what
thing,
it
Mary.
is.
It's also the ideas that you are
Mm,
putting forth too. So I kind of get past
absolutely.
the whole language experience and I just think about you're a human being and
Yep.
you have ideas to offer. So it may not be in like the most perfect Spanish. I don't think anybody can say they speak them. I don't speak the most
Right.
perfect English. I don't. So I
Oh,
don't even hold myself to any type of pedestal. I
mhm.
mean to any type of standard. But it really is about the human contact. It's about communication and really and really sharing ideas. I think that that's what it comes down to, um
Absolutely. No, absolutely. What advice, Florencia had asked in the chat, like what advice would you give for students who want to write stories, elements of successful stories, or focusing on developing characters before plot? Any advice you'd give?
Ooh, this is a big one for me. Okay, so let me just say I'm in the process of just learning and exploring different writing techniques. So I personally I'm a big story writer. I like to focus on the story,
Mm,
but I just started taking some writing classes and
so
they're
cool.
just like it's all about the characters, it's all not about the story, it's about the characters. I don't care about the story, I don't care about the plot.
Mm,
So I like to just tell people kind of what I do and I just write. I just write and then later I look at what I have and then I kind of, organize and then
yep.
I write. So it's like I always say this and this is so true. I write the book first
Mm,
and then I write the book. It's
right.
hard for me to I can't, I have to work with something, you know? Like
Mm,
I was one of those people, like it was really easy for me to help edit people's stuff in high school and do all,
totally.
I always have to work with something. I can't, it's hard for me to just come up with something. I mean, I obviously I come up with something, but I come up with just crap. And then later I write the book and the book may look
Right.
totally different in the end. So
Mm,
so yeah, I don't know. I think it depends on the person because there are people who like I think Shonda Rhimes, I'm taking her master class too. I'm like an
uh,
all girl,
shut
I'm in
up.
everybody's class. I love Shonda. She's big on just like characters and she's
Yes.
really big on dialogue. Oh my gosh, she's like so many like dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. But
Yes.
then I looking at a Stephen King video the other day and he's just really big on like, you know, well, he's big on characters too. But there was somebody else who was really fond of just like the whole story and how everything just
Mm,
works together. And yeah, I think it's I forgot the term. I think it's like, are you a pantsy? I think it's a pantsy writer. If you just write by like fly by the seat of your pants, or if you're like a plotter. And
right.
like I'm in the middle. I'm kind of both, depending on the day, you know.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, and I think it would be, it's got to be like that. It got to be dependent on your setting. How do you combat writer's block if you get blocked with ideas or blocked for inspiration? Is there anything you do to get yourself out of that block?
Read or research. If you're writing a book and you have writer's block, that means you haven't done enough research or you don't really
Mhm.
have like enough like, you know, ideas. So I like to I have a notebook. So I keep a notebook with me and I write in my phone, I write in my notebook. I write on the computer. So I just take notes every day. So I have this level of like fluidity, you know.
Mm,
And then I just see kind of like what sticks. But one of the things that could really help, what helps me with writer's block is I try. Okay, I forgot to say this. This is like my signature thing. Um, I never ever set out to write just in general. Even now, even though I have novels, so this seems kind of like antithetical, but it's true. I I always start with short stories. I
mm,
never say I'm gonna write a novel. I say this is gonna be a short story. Now, if it gets to a point where I have a few short stories now that technically they should be novels, but I'm like, I ain't got time. I'm like, it's
right.
short. I'm like,
Short
just
story.
read it with your kids over a month. Just get it on Teachers Pay Teachers, read it for a month. I'm not turning that into a book right now. But I
Mm,
think you should start small because short stories, like they're short, you can control the characters a little bit more and then come back to it later and see where you can expand, you know, because
right.
you already have like your structure, you already have everything into place. And I think it's easier. I think when we start off, it's like running. Like when you just say, "Oh, I'm going to run a marathon."
Right.
No, you start off, you know what I do? I take baby steps with everything. Seriously, I really do.
Right.
I start off with not even a 5K. I'm going to run 2 blocks. That's all I'm doing, okay?
There.
Yes, and then after that you build. So I would just take it very slow
Mm,
and yeah, and you can always you can like if you want to put a short story out there, I would also use I love Teachers Pay Teachers and that's how I started with all my short stories. I
mm,
would encourage people to put their short story once they've written it and have it edited and everything, put it on Teachers Pay Teachers because guess what? You get feedback. So
mm,
when people buy it and use it for class, they're just like, "Oh, I love this story," or "I hated this story and this is why. I didn't understand the ending."
mm.
I got feedback. Now if you think it's going to be a novel, don't do that. I don't know. I don't know, but I remember getting feedback on a short story one time, and the teacher said, "I don't like open endings," and I was just like, "Okay," but then I thought about it. I reread the story, and I was like, you know, this does kind of keep you wanting. So I finished, made a great ending, and then I took the short story off Teachers Pay Teachers, and I was like, yeah, this is a novel now. Because now I've done too much work. It was like, now you made
Right.
me work.
Now I'm invested, and now it's
Yes, yes,
that's
yes,
it.
yes.
That's so funny. Well, and you saying teachers pay teachers, I've seen there are so many things, now being tweeted about, as they should be, the injustices via things like teachers pay teachers. If I'm promoting something that's very clearly promoting some kind of narrative or whatever. Would you say that that is, and I'm no fun because all my stuff's on Teachers Pay Teachers for free. I'm like, I don't guarantee that it's good, but I guarantee that it's there. So take
Mhm.
it. So like take it for free. Would you recommend that as like a starting spot of like just getting a story out there or getting like a narrative out there and sort of like you said, getting immediate feedback from teachers, being like, hey, let's put it out there, let's see what happens. And then
Yeah, I think that's the best way to get it because number one, and you don't have to like charge a whole bunch. Like I have a lot of nice stories and I just
right,
charge like $3. Like
right,
people
dollar.
let me say, people have contacted me and they've like, you need to raise your prices. Like you're bringing, and I'm like, and let me just tell you the reason why I don't, and I'm not trying to influence anyone's politics here. Do whatever you want. I've worked with teachers where they had to buy their whole curriculum. There was
Same.
no
Yeah,
money in school. They had to buy the whole curriculum. So I've worked with people who spent thousands of dollars. And so
yeah,
for me, I know it's good material, but I'm just like, I just sometimes I just can't. I'm like, I can, yeah.
same.
I can't.
Mhm.
But what I would say is if you come up with a little story and sell it for a reasonable price. Let's just say you sell it for like $2 or $3,
Yep.
we want teach pay teachers. And I think you should sell it because you will get better feedback like that. If it's free, no one cares and they're not gonna leave feedback.
Oh,
If they buy it, they will leave feedback.
ooh,
Especially if they buy it and it's not up to par, they will leave feedback, and that feedback is good for you. Okay, because
ooh.
you later can figure out, okay, this wasn't a good story. Now, if you have friends that you can, who can read and give you feedback, that's also good too. I would recommend, and this a lot of people don't like this, but whenever I ask someone to read something for me, I pay them. So if you do have people reading stuff, I think I've gotten great feedback from people that I pay because they're
Mhm.
not like, oh, I couldn't do it tonight because I got this other stuff that people are paying me for. So now I'm like, I paid you, so I want that back on Tuesday so I can put my ads on it. So
And
I
I
know it's crazy. I mean, not crazy. I do think people should be paid for their time, but
absolutely.
that's yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the thing that many people find, that's the conundrum maybe that many people find themselves in is, okay, can I write from a perspective that I haven't experienced, like, or I've experienced, but like I don't identify with whatever, like whatever the identity thing is, then, who can I get to get feedback from? Then is it working to even teach my students? Because that's the whole freaking point, like all of that stuff is like, okay, yeah, but can I use it in the classroom? And then I feel like we get all these complicated steps of like who are we getting feedback from, what or whatever, whereas from each other and from teachers and from people in the target culture or target cultures, all of this serves itself, like feedback comes back to the appropriation thing, and all of that comes back, like all of it comes back to what's really important: are students learning from it? Are we able to create resources that we feel good about teaching with,
Mhm.
and that we feel represent what we feel is appropriate and just, and all of those kind of things? And it just kind of feeds a feedback loop. But I'm also a weirdo that feels really strongly in sharing, and I'm like, take it all, make it better, send it back, kind of a thing. But I think you're right. I think in sharing those things and getting feedback, like positive feedback, and that is great. But also the feedback that's like, didn't love the ending, is also great. Like all
Yeah.
feedback, like Brene Brown says, all feedback is a blessing.
Yeah. Yeah, because
You
you
know,
can do it. But let me just make a comment about the whole perspective thing because I think people also forget that you can write something that like takes place in a different country from your perspective. You visited that country.
right?
You can it can be from your perspective. So you don't necessarily always have to
Mm,
find like, oh, I want to write this from a perspective of a Guatemalan girl. Like, no, I traveled to Guatemala. This story, this thing that happened was just very
right.
special to me. So I'm going to tell it from my perspective. And you and I think that that's authenticity as well because you're talking about kind of the things that like happen to you and what
Right.
you've experienced. And that's, I mean, I think that that's another angle as well. And I just think also just
Yeah.
getting out again, taking that pressure off that it has to be connected to, to this, to a culture. It has to be connected to something that I'm not totally knowledgeable about,
Mhm.
or maybe my knowledge is partial. Well, just write from your perspective, write about your experience, you know?
Right. Well, and like Kelly said in the chat, like knowing where the criticism is and then also deciding if you want to listen to it or not. I had a principal who I thought was um pretty effective, and if you came to him and said, listen, like I've heard from a couple of people, he'd say, "Which people?" Not because he wanted to gossip or he wanted any kind of thing, but he'd be like, like I trust Rebecca, I trust Nolan, I trust Amanda,
Right.
I don't trust Meredith, that kind of thing. And it was like, and not even about trust and vulnerability, but it was like, mm, like I believe, like who, what's the criticism here? What's the forum? What's the, all of those I think are important. Like, what are we really looking at? Like you said, politically, is it a person that leans one way and they're like, this is not how it was in, I don't know, insert country, insert time period. And you're like, I don't know. I wasn't there. I thought, yeah, I mean, so how much can we tell? I mean, who knows?
Yeah, but here's the thing. If you're doing a lot of research too, then it's kind of like what you're researching is also, and let me
Right.
just say, I don't want to minimize the fact that I do believe that there are things.
Mm,
So, okay, so I believe that there are things that that you need to exercise wisdom in, like, should you write about this? I do believe that. And I do believe that there are
yeah,
people who unfortunately have, who have written from a very stereotypic, you know,
sure.
typical point
Sure.
of view. And I think that that also can be damaged. So I don't want to downplay that. I don't want to say
Oh,
that, I don't
yeah.
want to downplay that, because that is a reality. But I also feel like it's also a reality that, there are gifted writers out here. Like
Mm.
I was talking about today, the lady who wrote, the author that wrote Little Fires Everywhere. You
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and I saw, I didn't read the book, but I saw the series, and I just really like her portrayal of, you know, um, the single black mom in the book, and I don't know if in the book she ever even said she was black, but I know in the series she was. But I just really like, and I think the author's Asian. Um, and I really like I like the portrayal. I was like, oh my gosh, when I saw that, I was like, that is just spot on. Now,
Mm.
I mean, who am I? I mean, I'm just saying, like, you have to give props where props are due.
Right,
Like, I'm
right.
like, she's not a black woman, but she nailed that part, and vice versa. Shonda Rhimes, look at all the white and Asian and everything, just all the actors that she's written
Yep.
for. She nails it, and she's such she's prolific showrunner or whatever. I mean,
Incredible.
I'm like, that's talent right there.
Mm.
And I'm hoping no one said, Shonda, you're black, you should only be writing about black characters, black woman characters. No, I mean, she was just creative and let her creativity just open up and took the world by storm. So, and we get to enjoy
Absolutely. And we
Grey's
get
Anatomy,
right, and we
Bridgerton.
we get brazen at right. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
had to get Grey's in there.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think of like Tyler Perry and like you've got these huge things like Medea. I'm like, he's not a woman, but has that stopped us from being like,
That's so
yes,
true. Wait, hold on. I'm sorry. Before Tyler, there was Eddie Murphy.
right.
There was
Right.
Martin Lawrence. Okay, everyone's like Medea. No, Big Mama and Eddie Murphy.
Right.
Eddie Murphy did, yes,
Big
yes. Okay.
Mama's house.
Tyler came later. Tyler came later.
Right. Tyler
I
steps.
know you people from Atlanta. I like to give Tyler all the credit.
Yeah. He's right across the Tyler. Did you hear me plug? Okay, great. Yeah, no, absolutely. But like, can if only, God, I would die. I'd probably pass out. Like if you Regina just said flip Wilson, right? Like 100.
Yes, yes, you're right, Regina. Sorry about that. You're right. Preach, girl.
Amazing. Like if you only could write and a number of if you could only write from your perspective, or if you could only imagine from your perspective, I think to a degree your empathy would be hampered as well, because if we can only stay within our box, that's, I think, what sometimes puts us in an echo chamber of sorts, or what puts us, it's like, I'm only thinking as me. Well, maybe be a little more imaginative. And like you said, you've got to pay attention to what's problematic when it comes to imaginative, or who you're writing from. If my students are X and Y and I'm writing from their perspective, well, I got to be careful that I'm not fetishizing, otherizing, doing all the things, because I'm writing only as me. So I think we, investigate those things as well. And I mean, do the best we can with what we have when we have it, when either we have access to it, or when we can create it, or whatever, whatever it is that we can do, and whatever we have access to. Like you said, literally teachers, purchasing their entire library or curriculum or whatever. That's a lot of pressure to put on teachers, to be like, okay, you feel good about this, and then you're reading through your own library later and you're like, oh my god, like
Right.
this. We've had these conversations on Twitter, like, wow, this just says like they're poor but they're happy. Like, oh
Yeah.
my god, like, next, like, can we not do these narratives or these tropes or whatever?
Right.
And so working to not only not perpetuate the crap that's already been perpetuated, but also like the new narratives, right? Like joyful, whatever.
Yes, I agree. Yes, I agree. Like capture, I was thinking about this earlier. Not just the story, but the glory, you know?
Yes, yes,
So making sure that you like capture all that. And that's what I try to, like even at my school, like when we do like Black History Month, I tell teachers, I was like, okay, this is not just I was like, this is not just social justice stuff. Like our
right.
history is so much more diverse. Like
And slavery. Can we not, like,
exactly, right. Yes, our history didn't begin with that. So, and a lot of, and again, but see, here's the thing. You have to remember that a lot of people just don't know that. So
mhm,
you have to kind of like educate, you have to like kind of be a little patient. You have to educate them and, and help them. Now there are some people that they just don't care. And that's another story. But yeah, I think that, just making sure that we get away from, those tropes, um, and challenging them and just making people aware. That's the other thing. Maybe some people don't know. Maybe they're writing about some place where they are
right,
poor. Like I'm like, what's wrong with being poor? Why you have to say poor but happy? Like to
right,
me, like poor and happy, it's okay. There's
mm,
some people that are poor and there's some people that are rich and sad.
right,
Like
right,
I
right.
just
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think about, we were talking a few weeks ago, we're in the after party territory now, but we were talking a few weeks ago about, I used this text that I purchased that was about, oh dang it, Kelly Sita, where are you? I need you to pop in the chat the name of the thing that I never remember. Guajeros? I can't remember, but anyway, they're in like Guatemala, and they're the children that live and survive upon those like trash dumps. And I bought this text that I really liked. It was like level appropriate, whatever. And I had a colleague say, like, okay, that's a really cool, like, that's a cool comprehensible level of how you present what, guajero. I never get the word right. Guajeros. Thank you, Kelly Sita. Guajero. I remembered.
okay.
The guajeros. And my colleague was like, do you ever come back to Guatemala? Like, do you ever come back to that and not undo that narrative, but like, do you reinforce the fact that Guatemala is not just like trash dumps with children living in them? And I was like, nope, sure don't. Like, that was my, like, I was checking the box, because as a non-native, we're like, not that it's an excuse, but like we're learning and we're going like, like create like all of the relationships, plus our travels, plus our experience, plus our, all of those things lead to how we teach, what we know, how we know what we know, all of those kind of things. And I was like, no, I don't come back to Guatemala, because there's no time, or it's not in our whatever. And it's like those little steps that you realize, like, oh, they're literally like, the only time we ever talked about Guatemala was like children living in a garbage dump.
Wow. I didn't even know that.
Right, like, and there's like these different like right, like Kelly said, it's the
What?
danger
What?
of a single story. Like it's super
Yeah. Yeah.
sad, but
Right.
some of the videos will be the kids will be like, I mean, I'm okay. And then other videos are like the kids are like, help me. And so if you do the like I'm okay videos, it's like, look, they're, poor, but they're brown and happy.
Yeah.
And then the other videos are like, oh, let's help these kids in Guatemala. And you never see the like affluent parts of Guatemala. You never see any kind of nuance. It was like Guatemala, check,
Right.
nailed it. And I used to really like that lesson. And now I'm like, oh geez. Again, I paid money for, I mean, all of the things where you're like, oh, sorry. But the danger of a single story um is real, in a lot of ways, in micro ways and in macro ways.
Yeah, you reminded me. Okay, this is the after party. Okay, I'm just making sure.
I mean, listen,
Um,
here we
I'm
are.
like, I'm about to have Carlos bring me another wine.
Carlos.
So it's funny you say that because when I was reading this one story, that's very popular and it takes place in Mexico,
Hmm.
and it was one of those stories where it was kind of like the poor, the woe is me type story.
Yep.
And the weird thing was, but you know, so when I use it in class, and again, I think everyone's different. Okay. Let me just say, I think everyone's different. I have a different energy. Maybe it's not a good thing what I'm about to tell you, but this is just, I taught the book in class and this is when I had first started.
Mm.
But the funny thing was when I went to Mexico, okay, I went to Mexico, I did a semester there and I was like living the life. Okay. So when my friends, when I was about to go, I remember my roommate was like, okay, you're probably gonna have to, and this is just how people think, right?
Right.
And my roommate was from Africa. Okay. She was from Nigeria. And I remember her telling me, and she was well off, so maybe that's behind the comment,
Mm.
maybe. But
Okay.
she was like, oh, you're gonna probably have to wash your clothes in the river and blah blah blah. Because like you said, this is what people were exposed to.
Mm.
Just like someone could talk to my friend who was from Africa and make a lot of misconceptions,
Totally.
would ask her, like, oh, did you swim here? Like stupid stuff. Anyway, so she was like, kind of preparing me mentally. And when I went there, I lived in this really posh neighborhood. I had a maid, and I was like, everything was just so beautiful. And I remember we didn't have we were it was email back then, and she was
Right.
like, how's everything going? She's like, so
Amazing.
you have to wash your own clothes or something. I said, we got a maid. They made pancakes for me today. I was like, had this experience. And so when I came back to that book, when I read that book with my students, and it was kind of like highlighting all the poor stuff, I put it down and I said, listen, let me tell you about the Mexico I know. Okay. And
Hmm.
I remember telling the kids, I was like, when I went there, and again, this was like 15 years ago. I was like, their cars are newer than your parents' cars. Okay. I was like, they drive nice cars. And I was like, it's just so beautiful. And I lived in this colonia and I lived in this house. And they were just like, oh my gosh. And I was like, oh my, and the
Mhm.
transportation was just amazing. The food was amazing. And that was my experience,
Right.
That was my experience. So I think sometimes we have to disrupt that narrative,
Mm.
and we have to give students something else. Sorry. And we have to give students something else. And I just really try with everything I do. I always try to find, even if it's something like it's heavy, like even with the book that I told you about,
Right.
that was pretty heavy. But in the family, like even though this girl made the decision, her father was like, he was a cop, her boyfriend was a cop.
Mm.
The family loved her. The book was just about the art, the culture, the technology, and so there were so many positive things, but
Mm.
there was also this real thing that happens to people.
Mm.
There was this real thing where people, just good people, at the end of the day, it was like good people getting caught up in something. And you just have to be careful just not to let the narrative die there. You know what I
Right.
mean? It's kind of like, let's get to the after credits, let's
Right.
get to the other
Right.
scene.
What
So
happened next?
yeah,
Absolutely.
yep,
Mhm.
yep.
Absolutely. Well, and my study abroad experience, I think that it again comes to so much of our value system, we teach as language teachers so connected to our value system, be it, like Carlos, bring the wine, but like be it our spouse, be it our study abroad experience or lack thereof. So many people are insecure because they're like, well, I never studied. Okay, that's fine. No big deal. Like, whatever. And that kind of thing. Like, so much of it is based on who we are, what we do, vice versa. What we do based on who we are based on what we do, and all those kind of things. And my friend Roman talks about, he was our this past Tuesday webinar. He used to talk about Mexico the same way. He'd be like, girl, like
Yes.
Mexico. He's like, no, Audis, Mercedes, like whatever. He's like, the Mexico I grew up in was like super posh. Like, and then he moved, they came to California, and he was in like South Central LA, Compton, went to high school there, and he was like, I'm sorry, who? Like, what are we like? This is, whatever. But like, they were like getting adjusted. That's all they could afford, that kind of thing. All of the things that come with moving and relocating. And it was so funny because people would be like, oh, you're from Mexico. And they would immediately associate with certain things. And he was like, like, no, like the really nice neighborhood. Yeah, like he was like, okay. And so it's fascinating, those cultural perceptions like that we have until we've experienced them or we haven't.
Well, look at the cultural perceptions that people have of the US. Let me tell you, when I was in Argentina, people were like asking about Al Capone all the time. Like I went like my my husband.
Like, I don't know, he died 60 years ago.
Oh yes, he's like clients from Argentina. They would come here every year. So I wasn't there. They came here and we would take them out. And they're just like, they want to do the Untouchables tour.
Right.
And I'm just like, oh my, and they're just so obsessed with the gangster culture of Chicago and blah, blah, blah. And it's so funny because that's like their perception,
Right.
And
right.
like,
Okay.
I went to Detroit, and no offense to people from Detroit, but I was very offended by people in Detroit because I would tell them I was from Chicago. I kid you not. Now, here's a funny thing. In Chicago, everyone's like, don't go to Detroit. Well, I get to Detroit, they say don't go to Chicago. Because when I told people I was from Chicago, they were like, you're from where? Oh my gosh, you poor girl. And I was like,
you gotta go. Like,
I was like, Chicago is beautiful. I was like, yeah, we got stuff that happened, but it's beautiful. It's like generally a nice and safe place. And they're just like, how did you make it out alive? Like 2 people, when I told them I was from Chicago, they were just like, what? I was like, I can't with you people. But anyway, it's stereotypes, whatever.
Right. You're like, you people are ridiculous. Well, and how people romanticize things. People romanticize what's his face? His wife just got arrested or whatever, El Chapo. They romanticize these different things of like, drugs and weapons and, cartel and that kind of thing. The same way they romanticize all those guys, Al Capone,
right.
Face
Nelson. That's so true.
Yes. Right. Like they romantic, and it's like, nope, not a cute.
No, I'm like, not a terrorist.
Not a good. Was literally a terrorist, like domestic. Not
like Al Qaeda for Chicago. So yeah, let's not go great.
Not a good look. We don't like that. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and then I mean, all of the things that come with that, which are just like you said, just culturally bizarre. Because I grew up 90 miles west of Chicago. It was the middle of nowhere, and so it would be like, oh, you're going into town, and like into town was like a mile that way, and so like, oh well, Nalan listens to. She's kind of country, and it meant that she lived like 2 miles in the country. Like I lived in a neighborhood.
In Atlanta? Do you both live
in? Nalan used to, but she left us. She's in Louisiana now because she.
Oh right, okay.
Like that because she left us.
Cool.
I'm still upset. No, George is sad, but Louisiana's benefit. But like that kind of thing where you'd be like, so and so's 2 miles away. Like, oh, they're real country, girl. They're all. Stop it. Like anybody is country here. It's because we're in the middle of nowhere. So yeah, absolutely. You go any other place, you go to, for example, my Chilean colleague, when I was talking to her about actually this chat, authorship and representation, she was like, oh, like there's no racism in Chile. Like and I was like,
oh, I'm sorry. I couldn't control my eyes.
No, literally like my face, I was like, don't know about that. And but she hasn't lived there in nearly 30 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And her perspective is Chilean, and she was like, "No, we used to love, like, people of color. They would come and we would think they were so beautiful." And I was like, fetishizing.
They actually have Afro Chileans, by the way.
Literally, I was like,
Yeah.
"That's kind of fetishizing." And I feel like, ooh, like, so a couple of things. So I sent her a couple of things and we sat down to chat, but I thought how interesting that was, because that would be like, she's the only native speaker in our department who teaches Spanish.
Right.
And I
That's
was like,
interesting.
pause on that time capsule of her
Okay, so let
mentality.
me hold on. Let me just piggyback off this. So let's just say your friend technically, let's say that she writes a book, and
Right,
she writes a book on Chile. You think based on her perspective, is she gonna include the Afro Chilenos?
right.
They're
No,
not gonna be a part of that history,
no.
because that's they're not a part of. So that's the thing about perspective too. Even when you talk about your perspective, it is very limited. There are
Right,
people who, they may write about a certain thing, but you don't see other people that are part of the country coming up in some of the things that they're writing, or
right.
so I think that's the thing with perspective too, because it's
Yep,
like just like my friends, like the one, A and B. It's like if this person wrote something, it's gonna be one way, and that's just not
yeah.
that's not the only way, So
Well, exactly. And evaluating, like we would with anything else, evaluating a number of sources and then going from there. So maybe, like maybe some people have mentioned on Twitter when they've been disappointed to, like that thing where, oh, I purchased my library and, now I'm disappointed. Now I'm rereading the texts and they're problematic, or that kind of a thing. Maybe it's that thing of reframing, like where you are when you're there, and reading it, like you said, kind of like, as you are when you are, like wherever my perspective is, that's how I'm reading things. And so, I probably didn't see this as problematic at the time, but now it's a new lens, and
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
changing my mind.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and it can be a learning opportunity for students.
yeah,
It can be like if you do decide to read the book, and if it's not incredibly harmful, let me just say, because
I
I
mean,
would never,
right,
yeah, if it's something where there is bias, like there's bias in everything you read. I'm
right,
reading Unwind by Simon Schuster, and
right,
I'm like, it's a good book, but there's some parts, and I'm like, it's a little problematic, bro. But you
right,
know what? That's his
right,
perspective. That's his
right,
perspective, and I'm just and
right,
it's different from mine, and I can appreciate that. I'm not gonna write him and say, I didn't like this part
right,
because blah 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 blah. No, I'm just like, okay,
right.
it's just
Like,
like,
okay, fair, but also, yeah,
right. It's a good book though. It is a good book.
yeah. I'm gonna paste it in the chat there. If that, yeah, the problem with everything, is that the one?
No, it's called Unwind.
Oh, hold on. Dang it. Okay, ignore that. Ignore that. Like,
It's a dystopian book.
got it. Hopefully, this is it. Three teens fight for their lives
Yes.
and
Yeah.
each other. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's pretty good.
ignore the previous one. Yay. Well, dude, I super appreciate your time. Thank you. This is like not easy. I don't know what topics are easy, but like, especially these days. But
Yeah.
um, thank you for, yeah, like not an easy topic, but also like one that's very personal and to what you do, and being able to just like kind of talk candidly about it. I feel like that's, for me, what feels like fangirly is, I'm like, how do people write what they write? Like, how do you decide? How do you, kind of put yourself out there? Because ultimately, when we as teachers, and you obviously as a teacher, use materials, it's like, oh, like I hope this is, like, hope this is okay. Hope this is worth it. Hope this works with my students. Like all of those kind of things. And like Nalan said, like you're a boss, so like thank you for just your honesty and all of your candid reflections, because I mean, how strongly I believe about sharing. Like I'm a big fan of sharing, and I'm like, oh, better, you do better, better, you do better, better,
Yeah.
that
Right.
kind of constant cycle. So I think the more we have these kind of conversations, I think the more productive it is. So I appreciate your honesty and your time and all the things.
No problem. Well, thank you for having me. And if I had one little like last remark, I would say, and I think you just triggered this thought. Um, one of the things that I learned and something that I'm very beholden to is write for yourself and write for your students. Don't think about other people, you know?
Mhm.
And I think that when you write like that and you write from the heart, it will land, you know. And people are always going to say something. There's always going to be critics out there, and
Mm.
people are always going to have something to say. And I mean, take it in stride. And just continue to show up, be your authentic self, and just be expressive. Just do what it is you came to do,
Yeah.
and don't get sidelined by the sideshow.
Ooh, don't get Kelly, write that in the chat immediately. Kelly Sita, you have homework. Don't get sidelined by the sideshow. Yeah. Kelly's like, damn
Is
it.
Kelly Sita Kelly Ferguson?
Yes,
Ah,
absolutely.
okay.
Kelly Sita, chop chop. Check
Oh,
it out. All
Kelly,
right, screw.
yes. I love Kelly. I tell you, Kelly and I know how to party.
Uh,
That's
have
awesome.
I
Never
missed
forget,
out?
never forget, I never forget a good party girl. Okay.
Kelly Sita, have you been okay? That's fine. I'll text you in a little while, and you're gonna like, have I been missing out? No, yes, Nalan, write for yourself and for your students, not anyone else. I think that's man, that's so true because I think inherently I think you could replace right with plan and it also hits. You know what I mean? Like plan for your students because to me it still pushes ego to the side. Ego takes a
Mm.
back seat because ego wants to be front seat on the hood of the car. You know what I mean? Ego's like, hey, move over. Like you're here, I know, but like sit in the back, sit in the trunk, be quiet. It's that kind of thing where I think if you let ego get in the way, it's a lot of I don't know. Yeah, exactly. Kelly, like plan, teach, write, assess, boop, repeat, like more verbs, please. Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you focus on who's the most important person in this equation, is it the is it teaching or is it learning? And so if it's learning, then it's students, it's learners, like those are the most important people. And if they're getting harmful messages, absolutely rethink the whole thing.
Right.
If they're getting like maybe confused, like I feel like confusing messages and harmful messages are different. But also confusing has varying layers as well. How many times have you been confused in a target culture and you're like, oh, I said chanclas, sandalia, my bad. Like
Right. Yes.
whatever. Like whenever you're like figuring out confusion or whatever, it's like, is this a cultural thing? Or is this literally just like words? What are we doing here? And I think that's the power of what we do. So really getting to why we're doing and for whom we're doing what we're doing.
Yep.
And I think that's it.
Agreed.
Yeah, that's the priority. Well, yeah, I appreciate you. You know that. I'm about to text you a little something something.
Oh,
I'm gonna a little gift from us. I'm gonna stop the